Now I'm going to separate it just because it's easier to teach this way, but remember that these things are always connected, right? They're separating it is for ease of moving through it in a systematic way. The first kind of violence I want to talk about is what I'm going to call here subjective violence. It doesn't need to be called this. There are lots of ways we can call it. But let me say, for this one, what I'm talking about is obvious. But more than obvious, visible. So of the examples that we did earlier, which of these violences do you think would fit into the section of subjective violence? The obvious ones. Okay, a little bit more.
Like domestic abuse or rape.
In the media recently, which rape stories have you heard about? Over the past 2 years? Sorry? I mean specific individual stories about specific people. Okay.
Yeah, that other one made that
And then changed her story eventually. But
yeah.
yes. But okay, so the kind of rape or sexual violence where there's a high-profile person involved, it makes it a lot more visible and obvious. Other examples? I was thinking of the Annette Boyson case. You know, the most very explicit fundamental attack on the body kind of violence. And one of the reasons why this becomes so prominent in the media is because it's not normal. That's not normal. That's not what happens every day. You know, women, this is a really extreme case, and so that is what gets classified as rape. Whereas the everyday that is rape, where it's where you're not wanting to have sex, but you feel obliged or pressured or forced, or where it's you were drunk and so you were taken advantage of. Your skirt was too short, therefore it was an invitation. All of those don't seem to fit into this. This is about the big, you know, very, very obvious acts of violence. The ones I also wanted to include here are wars, guns, fighting. So this is also like you were saying.
Why does the other kind of rape, it doesn't fit to the subjective violence?
Okay. So,
because to me, rape is just a rape. No matter it's high profile, or it's been done in corrective way, or it's been done to me by wearing a skate. But if I'm raped, I'm just raped.
Because my point is that happens so often, all the time, and yet the stories we hear about are not those everyday stories. What we hear from the media, what we hear about as attacks on women's bodies are these very particular stories, like this is not normal. Whereas, in many cases, it's considered normal that if you're married, you should be having sex with your husband, you know? That's what you're there for, that's what your role is, according to all of these kind of, according to what is considered normal. So what I'm saying is that it's only when all of a sudden it becomes not normal that we hear about it. But I'm putting a pause button here, because when I get to objective violence, I'm going to elaborate. Okay. War, guns, fighting. What else of the things that we brought up are very visible? So when you say Marikana, what do you mean? The killing of a man is on that particular day, basically. minors, okay. The reason I want to separate that out is because minors die every day, but those aren't the ones you hear, right? The fact that you named a place, Marikana, and that was a stand-in for one event, as though Marikana is just that event. But minors are every day living in really bad accommodation, dying of asbestos poisoning, not in the platinum mine necessarily, in poverty, with no increases, bad union organizing or co-opted union organizing. Those would fit into objective violence. But you're right, the second that all of a sudden that violence is in our faces and it's the murder of 37 people, it becomes subjective violence. It's very, very physical and very obvious. Do you get the difference I'm making? Yeah? So there's this story that goes, there's this guy, and his bosses are pretty sure that he's stealing something from his factory. And every day, so they're keeping a good eye on him. So every day he comes out of the factory with a wheelbarrow. But he's just carrying the things he's meant to be carrying out of the factory. They're like, no, we know this guy. We know he's stealing something. And after months and months and months, they realize that what he was stealing was the wheelbarrows. So this is what I'm trying to get to when I want to move us from subjective violence. While we were making the zines, at the beginning the pictures people were finding were of aggressive-looking men, guns, war, and those are the ones that we're constantly told are violence, and that it's very difficult to not see. Right? It's very difficult to not see that kind of violence. But what I think the wheelbarrow is in this situation is the one I want to point us to, and actually, you guys pointed us to most of it, because most of the examples you gave are objective violence. Can be classified as the violence of the everyday. And it's those ones that we just don't see, or we're told is normal, or that flies under the radar, or we're silenced about. It's those ones that aren't the obvious gun, the obvious blood. And in fact, not only are these violences considered normal, they maintain the normal. So the way I say that is that somebody said earlier, violence as a weapon itself. I can't remember who said that. But I really like that, because it's not only that these everyday things that I'm going to go into in detail are forms of violence, but the very fact that they're there allows the world to function as it does, which means it allows for domination, forcing, pressure. It allows for discrimination on the basis of blackness, womanness, class. So, can you give me some examples of this, of what would fit into objective violence, considered normal, status quo? Thanks. Some examples of violence every day. Okay. In what way?
It's normal for the community to spend holidays on things that we used to do.
And when you use normal there, what do you mean?
It's not only that it's how people handle. There are many people who survive. People is not getting so it's normal as bad things.
Right. So the idea that that people are going to bed hungry is an act of violence. It might not show on the body as a bruised mark. It might not show as a gun, but it's an everyday act of violence.
Yes.
Right? But more than that is, somebody said earlier, that something like, while we're living like this, they're living in their mansions. Mm-hmm. And this is a key thing to remember. That not only is something like poverty and hunger a violence, the fact that for that to be made, for the rich to be really rich, this is required, right? is that for a comfortable life to be possible for some, this has to happen to others under capitalism, right? So poverty, but also extreme wealth in the face of this poverty. What else?
I think just to add on to that, like the fact that you have distinctions between white poverty and black poverty. Like as soon as there's a squatter camp with white people, then it's like it's the site of inquiry. Like people are so much more interested in it than the everyday of.
Because it's not normal for that to happen, right? That's a subjective violence for white people to be treated like that. But the everyday of black life is expected to be this. This is the kind of everyday violence. What about something about the workplace? So first of all of the questions around women's empowerment and women's equality are often have to do with quotas. So they're not about transforming the system. It's about getting the right numbers of people in. I'm sure Dawn spoke about this. But not only getting the right numbers of people in, not asking the question as to what needs to change in the system in the first place. So it says, okay, if we have 10 women in parliament, then we've done well. It's done. Women are in power. Instead of saying, what actually about this parliamentary system doesn't reflect, respond to, or speak for the majority of the population, right? So it's just about numbers, it's just about fitting in. But it also presupposes work. It presupposes that empowerment happens in the workplace. And yet someone said the very important point of what about transport as violence? You know, you sit in the train and it's air conditioned and, you know, you're not squashed and you know you're going to get to where you're going on time sometimes. But what is violent about other kinds of transport?
Oh, taxi.
So, you flash.
It's
Now such rules. They touch you wherever they want to touch you. And they call you.
So all of those things and time, the waiting, right? You've got to wait. You're at someone else's clock. You're not just jumping into your own car and going where you want to go. That is also a form of violence. And yet it's again one of those things that gets covered up, that gets shadowed. So while we talk about women's empowerment and we need to critique the ideas of quotas and it not being transformative, we also have to think of violence that happens outside of work. So not only in the home, because we'll get to that, but also in spaces that we live in. And then the way that we're told to deal with it is to cover up, dress better, don't drive late at night, don't walk on the street. Again, you need to change yourself. Remember some of our zines said things like fix yourself, change yourself, modify yourself, in order to fit into a system that is violent. Instead of really taking the time and doing the work and having the power to say, actually, I don't want to not walk on the street at night. I don't want to not wear a short dress. Because you're making me responsible for the failures of this violent society. And the person who brought up the story of the baby and the rat, who was it? Do you want to speak us through the violence that happens there, by the levels of violence that are happening in that story?
Okay, woman stays in a shack with Alex, violence one, and then gives birth and then becomes eaten. Violence two. That violence, her being arrested and restricted and by the state that put her in the shacks. So, right?
Yeah.
And then her staying in jail in a private place. And I don't even know if she gets
Exactly. So all of those levels of violence the responsibility being put onto the woman, none of the responsibility being put onto the state on the condition of housing, on the question of the penal system, the prison system in the first place. And it brings us back to one of the other things that we were saying, which is whose life is considered valuable, right? So here we're talking about the question of death. Remember I read you the poem earlier that was about the Palestinian woman, and very much what comes out in there is certain bodies and certain lives are considered more important than others. So that woman's child's life is important, but not important enough to have, given her access to housing, not important enough to have ensured a safe, clean, healthy space for her to be in, but important enough to punish her when a life that all of a sudden now to you is important, the life of the child, is gone, right? Again, Viva Stienka, this is what I was talking about in the examples earlier. A violent murder, of the kind of murder that happens every day in intimate relationships. But this is the murder you hear about because Oscar Pistorius' life is considered more important because of his whiteness, because of his fame, right? And her life is considered more important, the kind of violence we need to know about, the subjective violence, because it's a white body, because it's a pretty body, because there was so much potential. I don't know how many times you've heard that. So much potential. How can it happen in this lovely, gated community? That's not where those things, that's not normal there. It's normal for that kind of violence to happen in other places. So this is what I want to get to with objective violence. But there's something else that's happening with objective violence, and I want to put it as a small little bullet point over here.
Just a quick comment on that case. Also for me, the violence inherent in the judge then saying it was okay for Oscar to be shooting 5 times at the unknown black man behind the...
Because that is normal.
Because that's okay to kill that is correct? Yes. And also to add on that, Oscar used his disability as a defense. Because where he said he couldn't put the shoes, the legs, because of he was scared that the person behind the door was a butler and everything. So they took off the note that he has a disability, and which to me personally I think the disability is really exclusive.
And so, but what would be said, and has been said by many, is that anything is an excuse to kill if you're scared that it's a black man behind the door, right? There's any excuse. So this is the kind of language and kind of information that's used, because that kind of violence is normal. But the kind of violence that says, actually no, not only is it violent to kill your girlfriend, but whoever you thought that person was, it's a violent act. But then another level of violence happened. I don't know if you guys noticed, but after the judgment, what were the kind of comments people were making about Judge Masipa?
No. They were saying they were like defining descending, like Masipa is shit. It's full of shit. And some others they were saying Masipa was God. Escapade Mao mind Masipa so that he can get. Yeah.
And I think that also speaks to several levels of violence. It first of all does the work of subjective violence, which is saying that these things happen because there's some bad or evil people, not because the entire system is violent. But it's saying the only way that that kind of sentence could be given is if Masipa herself was a bad person. Not that this is the entire way the justice system, the legal system is set up, but it also was doing the work of, well, this is what happens when you put black women in positions of power. And I don't know if you guys got that, but often in the way that it was talked about was, yeah, well, what did you expect? You know, she of course is not going to finish Yeah, Harry, Nella, and Barry, whatever his face was, were amazing at the legal system. But the judge herself, you know, maybe she didn't really know, maybe, you know, the very much undermining of who gets to have the knowledge and the power. I want to come back.